I'm Dawn Skorczeski, AWS coordinator. Nice to see you all again. Today we have with us Scott Dalby. Professor Scott Dalby is an anthropologist. He has a PhD in anthropology. He teaches here at AUC. He teaches courses that he'll tell us a tiny bit about, and he will tell us about how he became an anthropologist and also about writing in anthropology. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Dawn. Nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
What do you teach at AUC? Tell us that first.
What do I teach at AUC? I teach big questions courses. I used to teach big questions in future society, but that that's no longer being taught at AUC. Now I teach two big questions courses. So I teach big questions in consciousness with some very savvy colleagues, and I also teach Laura and Dawn. I also teach big questions in the senses, so they're both 200 level interdisciplinary courses at AUC, and I teach a second year anthropology course called Anthropologies of Community.
Wonderful. And as an anthropologist, we don't know as a group what anthropologists study.
Anthropology is a kind of comparative social science. Especially in olden times, anthropologists would conduct research on cultures very different to their own. They would use a method we call participant observation. So we would spend quality time with people and really try and understand what their practices, what their culture, what they mean to those people, and to really try and understand that in a way that doesn't to try and develop a science that can actually capture all cultures and understand them on their own terms. I think that's the way I would describe it.
So you studied, I'm sure you did coursework, you did exams, and then you came to do your dissertation. Tell us about that.
You're talking about my master's or my PhD?
Maybe you should tell us about both, actually, because so far we have a broad description of what anthropology is, but not a very clear sort of understanding of what your role as an anthropologist has been as a student of anthropology and then an anthropologist.
Okay, so as a student of anthropology, I mean, let's just look at the master's program. I mean, you have to read a lot of monographs. So anthropologists write very detailed books about a particular culture, that you write about everything about that particular culture, how people get married, what kind of clothes they wear, how they wash babies, I don't know, everything, what religious practices they have, how they and they're called monographs, and we have to read a lot of those. But then you have to start thinking up, okay, what do I want to do my research on? Like, what is important to me? What's important in the world? Like, what's a contemporary subject that's of relevance? What can I actually do? And the idea of spending quality time with people means that you have to give a lot of space to doing field work. And field work is kind of, I think it comes from geology, right? The idea of field work. But actually, as social scientists, we use it as a way of saying, well, we leave the university, we leave behind our books and our colleagues, and we go and we search and seek out the people we're interested in, and we spend time with them. We introduce ourselves, we tell them about our project. In best case scenario, we ask them what's most important for them also in the relationship. And then we interview people, we just participate in and do what they do as far as that's possible. There's a bit of a tension there. We can talk about that in a bit. And we make notes. We make very detailed notes on what people do, what they say, how we feel in that role of being a researcher, but also a participant, what kind of complexities come up in our relationships with the other people that we're studying. And we interview them about what it is that we want to know about, what kind of questions we have. Yeah.
So talk about your research when you went out into the world and did your
Okay. So this is a long time ago, okay? You have to bear that in mind.
All right.
When I came to choose what I was interested in, I actually met with the professor that was in my study program. And the professor was like, hey, I get the idea you're a bit like me. When I was trying to pick my subject, he said I wasn't really interested in developing a career or picking something that was about earning money. I picked something that I dreamt about as a child. It was like a passion, you know, it came from somewhere. And he said, you know, what did you dream about as a child? So it was immediately put on the table, you know, who are you? What are you doing? What do you find important and interesting? So when I was a child, I would dream about China and sometimes India. I was fascinated by India, but particularly China. And that's because my father was a kung fu teacher. And in our house, he was also interested in Chinese antiquity, in particular, like swords, kung fu, pictures of like wise masters sitting on rocks under waterfalls. We had the I Ching in house. No, we had like the classic Chinese kind of spiritual texts. And we watched my father's idol was Bruce Lee.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know who
Of
Bruce Lee
course I
is? Like,
do.
yeah.
I don't know if the students do. Was your
No,
dad a professor?
no, not at all. My dad was a mechanic. It's not, but that's not a professor at all. No, I was the first person in our family to go to university.
That's how I am too. So I
Yeah,
love
yeah.
it's a great
So,
story so far, right? So your
okay,
dad was obsessed with Chinese culture and all things Chinese, and you saw them growing up and dreamt about them. And then,
yeah. Um, so I put that on the table with the professor, and he said, "Well, what are you interested in terms of theory? You know, like what classes have you been following?" And I was like, "Look, the thing I'm most interested in is the body." You know, I'm just so fascinated by anthropological approaches to the body, and I'm also interested in religion, like anything that really means something important to people. Um, so, anthropology of religion, anthropology of the body, and China. And very quickly, my supervisor was like, "Hey, have you been reading about this phenomena called Qigong, Qi exercises? It's really big in China at the moment, and you know the Communist Party have been promoting it as a health practice, but there are also other people that see it more as a religion." And so, and I was like, "Oh wow, this sounds fascinating." So I went online, searched for articles, and I was like, "Boom, this is what I'm fascinated by. This is what I'm going to write my master's about."
so when you say you searched for articles, what search terms would you use for such a thing?
Qigong, Qi
Okay.
exercises,
Yep.
China, religion,
Yep.
politics of Qigong.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, I'm interested in it was interested in a personal sense, but I think I was also interested in the relation between religion and the state, religion in history. I mean,
Mm.
it continues, right? You keep searching. You're like, wow, it's fascinating. What is religion in China? It's not actually what we understand religion as in the West. Why did the emperor wage wars against religious societies and suppress them in history? And why is it that the atheist communist state in China is still suppressing religion now? What about these practitioners? Why were there 40 million people practicing this particular form of qigong?
Are,
Hey,
are these all questions that you're asking, thinking about moving towards your research, or I'm trying to think.
not really clearly. I mean, you know, I've written a
Yeah,
PhD about this now, right?
yeah.
So maybe I'm starting to move into that. But I think at the master's level, I was just really like interested in the question of how is it, why is this religious group persecuted in China?
Ah,
And how is it that, what are these people are about? Do they really believe that they can connect to chi energy? Do they really believe that? Um, that they can become enlightened through this practice? And how is it that some people are able to even um, uh, forbear and endure torture because of their belief in this in China? You know, how is it that people die for that? All these were like the questions that
yeah.
buzz around your mind. But of course, you have to write a master's thesis, and in
That
anthropology, you have to go and collect your own data.
even in the master's program.
For the masters, yeah, we had 3 months of the 1 year program was
Wow.
dedicated to going and doing field work.
Yes.
So this is before you even think about like writing. You have to write a proposal and you write a literature review. You know, what kind of theory am I interested in? What kind of questions do I have? But
Oh,
you have to spend those 3 months making contacts and collecting data and doing those asking those questions in interviews, participating yourself, learning these chi exercises. I went to London. I was interested in Falun Gong in the kind of London city.
oh, yeah.
I didn't really have any money. I couldn't
Didn't
afford
go
to
to
go
time.
and fly somewhere exotic. I was very practical, and I did it in Holland as well. I traveled all over this country to find practitioners,
Oh,
Chinese and non-Chinese, because I was also interested in how is it these kind of white spiritual types are getting involved with a highly persecuted Chinese Qigong practice. How do they see that? Do they get involved politically, or do they just, do the exercises? Are they a bit like me? Did they have a father that practiced Qigong? And
yeah.
yeah,
And what did you find
for the masters or for the PhD?
for the masters?
For the masters. I found like a mix. I found that actually Falun Gong was predominantly being taught by Chinese people, but indeed there were these kind of New Age types coming involved. Falun was experienced by them as a lot more authentic in terms of the kind of powerful experiences they would have, but also it was about a kind of ethics of uh, doing something about the persecution in China, the fact that this was being persecuted.
This is
Um,
what you discovered, Scott? Like this
this
is,
is what I
yeah.
discovered. I mean, I had a research question like, how are people becoming involved? And I was really looking at the body. That's where the body comes
Okay.
back in. So I was looking at a lot of theories about discipline of the body.
Okay. And that's in your
Um,
literature review. You had
I
theories
was
about
in the literature review. Yeah,
that.
I read like Foucault and Tal al-Assad and other like anthropologists that are really curious about how through moving the body or holding the body in particular postures, do people have particular kind of experiences of body, but also self, and how they identify that, and how I was interested in how that makes them become a part of a wider movement
When
and
you got to
helps
that, oh, sorry, go ahead. No, when you
and
got,
helps produce convictions like within people, to do
oh,
something. Yeah.
that's really powerful.
Yeah.
Um,
That's what I was fascinated by then, by the way. That's
so
yeah.
did you know, it sounds to me like you had the question, but it wasn't as refined as the one you just asked, the couple of questions you just asked um, about this topic. And I wonder if the literature review, which all the students have to do a literature review in a couple of weeks, did that help you refine the question? Or did you already have the question by the time you had the literature review underway? Did
Mm.
you read first and then figure out the questions, or did you go back and forth?
I think I read first. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I, it was the same with my PhD. I really just go on, okay, what am I interested in? And inside, you have this intuition and you know that something feels good, right? You know that there's a path somewhere. You have no idea why or what it's going to lead to, but you just go with, well, this is what I'm interested in, and I'm just going to keep going. And with me, it just grows and grows and grows because I want to know everything. I want to go in all directions, and that's not always the best way, by the way. So I, one thing that helped was just to find a really good article. I found this article, and because there's a lot of mysteries, right? When you pick a new subject, and you can read what Falun Gong say, you can read what the Chinese state say, but then you need an anthropologist that has been there and spent a lot of time and can kind of give what for me is not necessarily an objective view, but an academic view on what is the situation and what kind of questions might be interesting. And that was Nancy Chen's article about anti-cult campaigns. And she really put the whole thing in a context because the state was saying that the movement I was interested in, Falun Gong, was a cult, an
Uh,
evil cult. So
oh,
I found that really interesting. Like,
yeah.
okay, um, so what she basically did was take that concept and put it in a historical political context of what it means to be a qigong practitioner in China, but also how they're going global. like the globalization of these techniques of the body. So that was really like, wow, she's already done so much. She's already managed to put this issue within a broader kind of in relation to broader questions that anthropologists of religion or anthropologists of globalization or anthropologists of the body or anthropologists of China, what all these different people are interested in, she's already like speaking to them. So that's really helpful. That's a really helpful for beginning spot. Something that is also very helpful, this is more like a tip for the literature review thing. I know the students have to do that soon. In my field, and I'm not sure if it's the same with all social sciences, but my feeling is it might be in the humanities or sciences also, but especially in anthropology, we have something called the annual review of anthropology. And so what that is every now and again, an anthropologist picks up a subject, let's say disability, and they write about how that's been approached within anthropology, like historically, and what is now like the current thinking on it. What kind of concepts were important? How did they develop? And very quickly, you've just got access to just about everyone that's ever written about this subject that you're interested in. It's really good. I'm not sure if other majors have that or not.
That's really great to know about the annual
But I
review.
recommend that if you're interested in a subject, just check out the annual review of anthropology.
Great.
Look it up, but that's also particularly for anthropologists. I think
Right. Well, that's good. Some people will
outside, but
no. Some people will do anthropological research.
They can textualize the subject, but also doing research on it in very useful ways. Yeah.
Excellent. This is really helpful. So tell us now about your PhD, because I know you have an interesting story to tell about that.
Okay, so PhD, the master's went well. In fact, one day I walked into the office of my supervisor as he was reading my master's, and he was just turning the last page as I walked in. And I did everything at the last minute. I had worked on it a lot, but it just didn't work. And at the last minute, it all came together, like the pressure of a deadline. I gave it to him. And when I walked in his office, he was just turning the last page and he said, "This is such a wonderful master's thesis. Because you're terrible at writing in terms of you make a lot of English mistakes. I'm from the UK, right? So I'm from a particular part of the UK. But he said, it's just beautiful. It's really, really strong. It's so analytical. It's really... did you ever think about doing a PhD? And of course I hadn't at that point. So basically he said, look, it's competitive, but if you write a proposal to the Dutch Scientific Council, hopefully you can get a scholarship. I would love to work on something like that, with this project. I can see that it would make a really good PhD. Think about it. It's hard to do a PhD. It's very lonely. You have to go and do 1 year's field work on your own, and think about what you might be interested in, and we'll have a talk. So I got a cum laude for the master's.
Nice.
I thought about it, and I went back to him and said, you know what, I'd like to do a more broad project. I want to go to Hong Kong, where it's really politically sensitive, Falun Gong, because it's part of the PRC, but it's also has this space to contest the persecution across the border. Yep. I said, I want to go to New York because that's where the master lives. That's where the master, the guru of Falun Gong lives. And he now globalizes it from New York, where he has a green card,
Okay.
So that was the basis of my proposal. It got accepted by the NVO. They approved it. I got a full scholarship. So that means all of my 1 year field work in Hong Kong and New York, like completely covered. And you get a 4 year PhD placement. First year is preparation and extending your literature, reading, doing research on that level, preparing for field work. The second year is just field work. You break complete contact with the university. You go and travel and you live and you try and find these people and make contact with them. You do your participant observation. You do your interviews. And I had a plan that I would use my own body and experiences to try and produce data. because one thing became clear is that some of the postures actually induce pain, especially on Western practitioners, which I found really interesting. And I had experienced it myself in my master's, but I wanted to so I read everything there was to read about pain and the
Oh,
body
wow.
and China and before in preparation. But of course, when you land there, and I realized that I was going to be participating every day in these exercises where you have to sit for 1 hour in the full lotus position.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And I couldn't do that. I sat like this, like literally with an arched back. I just couldn't meditate. I couldn't even sit in the posture. But that was a really important entrance point for me with those practitioners. And I mean, I can talk about the field work, but the third year you basically come back and teach and analyze your data. And the fourth year, ideally, you write your PhD and you submit it and you get a PhD.
Okay.
It took me 10 years
to do the fourth year, or to do all of it.
To do the whole thing.
Okay.
to do the fourth year. No, the whole thing. So it took me 6 or 7 years to do the fourth year. And one reason it took so long is because I had a particular experience during my field work that made it very difficult for me to write as an anthropologist, because anthropologists are trying to understand other people's view, perspective. And what I did not expect, but what happened, was that my whole project of the PhD was understood by practitioners of Falun Gong as an attachment, as in a kind of Buddhist sense. So not only was there these painful postures, but my whole PhD project, as in approaching Falun Gong as a scientist, from what they understood as low-level kind of theories, was actually something that would prevent me from actually really understanding what it is. So at one point in my field work, I became a bit more immersed, because it's 1 year and you're around people every day, and doing these exercises also has an impact on who you are and how you experience yourself in this world. And at one point, it got quite confusing for me, and especially when a practitioner I really respected, who was what we call a key informant. So in anthropology, we have this: you always meet a person that really helps you gain access to others and gives you the information you really need to answer your core research questions, which for me were all about how do people become incorporated, and how is that a part of the way in which this movement is being reproduced, this political resistance movement against the Chinese state in mainland China from outside. How is this process interrelated? And of course, I had media and the body and self-discipline as like my three important areas that I wanted to understand that.
When you say media, so media, the body, these are your key terms, kind of.
Like media, the body, and self-discipline. Yeah.
Okay.
But media, I mean very broadly, by the way. In the field that I work, media is not like television and newspaper. Media is, it could be like music and sound. It could be the space, how it's designed, anything that is a material object that mediates somebody's experience of their body and themselves.
Okay.
It's all about the materiality of how the kind of experiences that these practitioners were describing to me. I was really fascinated by how that relates to the materiality of space, sound, media, what they do, what they experience.
Okay.
But what happened to me, let me finish the story, sorry. What happened to me was that this practitioner I respected, the key informant, she basically one day told me that she was really kind of disappointed that I hadn't really understood what Falun Gong was about. This was like after 6 months of intensive fieldwork research. And she said, I'm trying to work it out. I see you come. I see you really earnestly trying to endure the pain and, improve your meditation. I see that you're also attending political events. I see that you're talking with everyone. But I also see you go away and secretly make your notes, And I can see that you're doing it because you're attached to the idea that you can understand this from your low-level scientific understanding. and because you want to go back to Holland and you want to write a book and you want to get a job in a university. And she says, but you don't understand what we do in Falun Gong. This is called cultivation, self-cultivation. It's like refining your body, but also yourself. And we do that through giving up attachments. And you don't see, but your whole PhD is the biggest attachment. And if you really want to understand what we do and what this means, this truth that you're searching for, but are so misguided, you have to give up your PhD.
Oops.
Oops.
That's pretty serious.
Yeah. Well, for me, it was like, in many ways. I mean, and when we come to write, I write about this experience in my opening of my PhD, and I will tell you why in a short while. But Dawn, it hit me like a sledgehammer. I cannot tell you in every way. This was a Chinese woman that was telling me this, and put aside the whole thing of colonialism. The white male anthropologists wanting to go to China and understand this spiritual movement that's already being persecuted by the state, to try and put this in their own language, which has nothing to do with the religious, spiritual, regional language of this particular cultural form we're talking about. But it also hit me, anthropologists should be aware of this, in terms of representation, this whole politics of representation and power, right? The power of representing the other in languages outside of their own. It hit me in that way. But actually, personally, I was convinced that she was right. There was something deep inside of me coming up, and I was like, oh my God, she's right. I can't understand this way. And I was so long. And Dawn, it was really about, it was about my own healing. I was looking for my own, all this stuff comes involved, like from my family's traumas, from my own traumas. So just contemplating giving up that PhD, which for me would be like phoning my supervisor and saying, look, I'm giving up. I'm going to follow this a different way, in a way that felt very authentic for me at the time. Just contemplating that, I felt the power of the gong that the Falun Gong practitioners would talk about. It was like stepping into a powerful river. I felt this immediacy with the principles and the power of this movement, and this master who is engaged in leading these Chinese practitioners in a resistance against the state. I filled it all in with my own embodied experience. Wow. So what this practitioner actually did was make me experience, really for the first time, what it might mean for me to actually be a practitioner. And it was something that I could never get to as doing the participant observation. And so it was a very overwhelming and very confusing experience, because my mind started somersaulting, wait a minute, do I want to become a follower of this master? Do I trust them? What about my future? What about my PhD? What will my parents say? What about a job? I would be giving up my whole life, actually, and putting it at the floor of this master that I don't understand or know that well yet. I mean, I've read a lot about him. I still hadn't met him at this point, by the way, but in person, it was all digital, So it was very confusing.
But then you got to do a PhD. So what happened?
Well, this is the background for why it took 10 years. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
So, but maybe I just say this: doing anthropology is very complicated and can be very confusing. So you need to be prepared. I basically was on the floor for, I think, 4 weeks or something. I really just didn't know what to do. I really did not know what to do. But
I know that
but in
experience.
the end, what I did, I just started sharing my experience with other practitioners. I made some calls to friends and told them about it. And some friends were like, "Come on, just do your PhD." But then forget about all this. I actually didn't listen to them. I didn't listen to them. But what I did, I shared with practitioners, and what I discovered is that many of the practitioners that I met with had similar dilemmas, similar confusing problems, where they had to give up an attachment to something. Maybe they were concerned about their health. That's why they were involved, because these chi exercises are apparently very good for your health. They were looking for healing. And what happened through actually just sharing honestly, this is the miraculous thing about anthropology. You don't have to pretend. You can just be who you are. You actually make connections with people, and actually lots of things opened up. And I ended up getting to go to meet Master Lee, the master of Falun Gong. I ended up living with practitioners for 2 months, like in Hong Kong, which really gave me so many experiences, but so much access to data. And yeah, I got to interview practitioners that actually smuggled media between Hong Kong and China because of opening up in this way. People that were like resisting the persecution in China. I got to interview people like that as well, which probably would never have happened if I hadn't have done that. And I didn't know that. I really just didn't know what else to do. And the last thing I'll say, because I'm sure you have more questions, but about something else, is, oh yeah, it just got really confusing when I got back to Amsterdam, because even though because I became more immersed in the movement. It was a really strange kind of situation. I got all this access and my project flourished in one way, but in another way, I became more and more immersed in the movement. I had more and more connections with practitioners. I went deeper into this idea of self-cultivation through sharing. And my project became steered more towards what is like the more political and ethical interests of Falun Gong than what I would have originally proposed. So when I actually came back to Amsterdam, I met with my supervisor, and they were like, "Okay, I want to see, what's the plan for chapters, which each chapter." And Dawn, I just wasn't able to write. I didn't know how to write about my experience. I didn't know how to do it that way anymore. When I came back, it's like I'm a different person now. I can't do it this way, you know. It's like,
wow.
And it was really confusing. I was still practicing. I was living in Amsterdam. I was going to the park, and I was still doing these exercises in the park. And in the morning, it was still my kind of regime of health and spirituality. And what happened over the next 6 years was I kind of went from completely abandoning my project. I even adopted some hedonistic practices because of my confusion, which is never a good idea. But eventually, I kept coming back to the PhD, and I was always searching for a way that I could do it. I could write my PhD whilst honoring myself, but also honoring these people that I shared time with during my fieldwork, without explaining away what they do, what they experience, and what they believe. Believe it or not, that is incredibly complicated, really. But the end product is that I decided to write about this experience just to open my PhD. It's like okay, this is what happened. And these are the kind of questions I had afterwards. So
you wrote it more like the journey, like you wrote a dissertation about the journey that you had taken from one.
No, I mean, the structure of the PhD is because I had 2 different locations. So it opens with my dilemma if you want to understand Falun Gong, give up your PhD. And what I experienced and how I interpreted what was happening to me and how that hadn't happened in the normal role as an anthropologist. But one of my supervisors was always trying to steer me towards, okay, you have to put the focus on them. And you have to put the focus on the academic questions that you're interested in, that we're having here in the university about religion, and about the relation between the body and media, and how people become convinced of their religious beliefs and experiences through these experiences that are materially being induced. So he kind of steered me really towards like theoretically explaining, and it never really sat that well with me. But I wrote my PhD. It's here.
Oh, you have it.
It's called Disciples of the Buddha Law.
Oh, it's beautiful. What a beautiful.
These are people in a park in Hong Kong, one of the practice sites where I did research. Yeah. Anyway, you probably have questions. I don't know what else to say.
You have that book which you wrote. Your PhD was a book.
Yeah.
And so, open up to your references section.
References.
So you were telling us a story about yourself and your informants, right? And yet,
you mean the bibliography, right?
Bibliography. So in anthropology, you have a bibliography, right? I assume that's written in APA style.
I think it's APA. Yeah. I have a PDF if you want, if it's easier to share.
That would be great. Actually.
Yeah. Share screen. Can I share my screen?
Yeah, or you can give it to me after, and I'm going to load it up onto the site so the students can look at it. Because I think for the students and the teachers, it's going to be really interesting to see how the story that you just told us turned into that document. And what I suspect, Scott, is that the agony involved in part was the agony you've already told us about, right? That you almost thought you had to give it all up. But there must have been agony in the actual writing of something in a form that's really different from what you were doing, right? So you're doing body work, you're doing work in another culture, you're immersed in it, you have all of these contacts, it's very political. You're working on self-cultivation, but it's in relation to a very big political movement, which really matters to you and to the people involved very much, and to the world. So there's all that. And then there's this dissertation advisor who helps you, I hope, shape it into a book, which is really different.
What helped was my second supervisor, because he was the opposite. He was the opposite of supervisor number one, let's say. He was very academic, very like, come on. But this other one was like, no, you just got to write yourself in. And it's he loved it, the story, and he's like, you have to just open your PhD with this. And he was really supportive, and I also like his work. He really writes himself in, and in his PhD, he's a homosexual, and he's even kissing one of his informants. There's a photo of him kissing one of his informants in his book. So he's really like, no, what is an anthropologist? We really have to break out of these conventions. And I felt a lot of support, but also like hope that I could actually do it, through his support. And indeed, the way that I did it was to really find a way of writing myself in, but also including the people. I had very rich data on these people, so I would spend a lot of time. And it's one of the beautiful things about writing anthropology is we write like very thick descriptive vignettes. So I will open a chapter with a thick kind of descriptive vignette of somebody, how I met them, what they looked like, what they're doing, and then I would like tell the story I wanted to tell about them, that. And I loved writing like when I wrote like this, it just flowed, I was back there, I could sense everything. But then when you have to start saying, well, as can be seen in this opening vignette, Jian was, put in a position that is unbearable for most people, between the police in China and his family, asked to renounce Falun Gong. To make that connection to like the really interesting theory that I was interested in about sovereign power in the body in China, to make those connections was actually quite difficult. as interesting as I found that, I'm as fascinated by these kinds of questions. You know,
So
how
how
is
did
it
you
that?
do that? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
How do I do that? Yeah, I don't.
Yeah.
It just took a lot of time, Dawn. I mean, I just couldn't write it in one way. You know, it took revision after revision, abandoning for a year sometimes, and then coming back and like, what was this about? What's important to me now? And I think at one point I became interested in yoga because I just didn't want to see Falun Gong anymore. I didn't want to do these exercises. I didn't want to do the academic part, but somehow I found yoga and it really like helped me relax. And then I went back and finished it ultimately, but it took a lot of drafts,
Yeah. Yeah.
a
And
lot of deleting, rewriting, abandoning, coming back. No, this has to go in another chapter. No, this is not interesting. But this story, this descriptive story of this person and this dilemma, these are really the things that held a
yeah.
chapter together. And maybe like, yeah, this is about resisting sovereign power and pain, but that story is stories we collect as anthropologists. They're really gold. And actually, one of my friends once said to me, he says, theories come and go, but the stories, they say they are like, and your experiences of being in the field. And if you can integrate those and reflect on anthropology as a limited discipline, uh, and you can maybe see what this group have to say that's interesting for us to learn from. We can actually learn from them. If you can do that, then yeah, I think that's really what I was trying to reach for. And to be honest, I don't think I was really that successful.
Oh, you were. You have your book again.
No, yeah,
Here
no,
you
to a
are.
certain extent. I
Yeah.
opened my PhD with this story,
Yeah.
and at the end is like I can't resolve this tension between what Wang said and my academic. I just can't solve it. That's
Right.
my conclusion. I just can't do it. But
Yep.
these are, if we look at it academically, this is the kind of thing that I can say about how people become incorporated
So,
into this movement.
so Scott, this is so interesting because what students are working on right now is what we're
Yeah.
calling the lens paper, which is that they have a focal text, like in your case, it would be the stories, and then they look through a lens, a theoretical text, at the focal text, right? So they have a theory, for example, in one class of the ecological self, and they're seeing to what extent they can see something about the ecological self in the animal article that they're reading about animal cells.
Okay.
It doesn't fit together necessarily, but they're trying to figure out what they can see. And what I hear you saying is you have these stories, those are your focal texts, and you have to figure out which lenses to use for each story. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So I was hoping I could just think very quickly of
Well, you
an
can look at your
example.
chapter titles too, because
Well,
that might.
what I will do is the story of I'm putting the emphasis back on myself rather than on them. Let me try and okay. So well, a lot of practitioners have these experiences where they put their arms in the air like this for 7 minutes, and then they have to drop their arms for another 7 minutes like this, or they have to meditate for 1 hour with their legs in full lotus position. And what a lot of practitioners were sharing with me is like, yeah, it's painful, but actually, what they two things were happening. So either they would explain that they feel this power, this energy, this chi energy, for example, or what practitioners call gong, Gong, chi energy, because of doing these postures. So, right, they experienced it. Wow, this gong energy. Wow, what Master Lee says is real. Falun, it really does exist, this energy. I can feel it. And if I can feel it, it's real. It can't be placed into question by a Chinese state that say he's just making up everything, right? Um, the other thing that happened was one of my other findings was about this pain. So through the process of adopting these postures and forbearing the pain and not giving up, even when you think, oh no, I don't feel my feet anymore, they're going numb, but to persevere is that people notice that they become they have stronger convictions in their life. They don't give up in situations at work that are difficult. Right? They don't, if they're threatened by someone on the street because they're handing out flyers about the persecution in China, they're not afraid anymore. They're not afraid of the Chinese state. So in both examples, I mean, the first one, I was reading a lot about the anthropology of religion and theories of mediation that talk about how practitioners become convinced of their religious beliefs. And it's always through material arrangements that produce extraordinary experiences that need to be explained somehow, that can't be explained in secular language, but can be explained through the language of spiritual groups like Falun Gong. And through that process, they become convinced, and they become more and more a part of, incorporated into religious practices and religious organizations. It's about making a collective through shared experiences. And it's a very social scientific idea. It's very Durkheimian kind of, right?
But yeah.
So I was making that connection with theory through not only my own experiences of Gong, because I've also had them, but also those shared by practitioners, to try and like talk with these anthropologists, and say, actually, yeah, we see that happening in Falun Gong, but actually there's something a lot more, something different happening about everyday discipline here, about these painful experiences, and that relates very much to interrupting theories about state sovereignty and their own monopolies on pain and discipline.
So that seems like a really sophisticated idea, Scott.
Yeah, but to make those kind of bridges, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of reading. You really have to understand the theoretical world and the discussions.
Yes.
But you have to honor what you experienced. You have to honor what the people you spoke with and interviewed, what they say, and you have to try and bridge them. And through writing these vignettes, but then there has to be some kind of bridge in between. And that bridge is really like just picking out and saying, well, these are the kind of discussions these guys are having over here. You have to, and then you come back to your question, how are people incorporated? So if I take this data and I take these theoretical discussions, then it's quite clear that, if I understand this part of my question, you have to keep coming back to your main governing question.
That what you just said is really a beautiful description of, I think, doing the work of an anthropologist. Right.
Yeah. Like, in what way? I don't even know.
Our first unit was about entering the academic conversation, right? And our first conversation this week was with Laura, a neuroscientist, and she showed us how she constructed a conversation about anxiety and depression and the brain, making use of a lot of studies that existed and also her own data, and how she worked with these together and wrote version after version herself to figure out how to present these findings to a journal for, in part, a drug company, so to solve a problem. And here you went through this pretty profound experience, life-changing experience, and you're trying to write about it in an academic context. And part of what that involves is being true to what you experienced, to really think carefully about what happened to you and to figure out how to describe the people that you were interacting with in some ways without a bias, but of course you do have a bias, but to try to capture them, and then to think about these stories that you're telling in relation to theoretical conversations in your field, which you're defining yourself, right? Like you're figuring out what those conversations are. So
and I'm always you're always in a hierarchy in education as well, Dawn. You know this. If you're a master's or a PhD student, you're being guided by someone above you. Yes. And they have the authority to just say, no, this chapter is just not good enough, Right. So you're always working in that field of power as well.
Really helpful.
I just remembered something that really helped me, which I failed to mention so far, is that one of the best things I did is when I actually got a job at AUC, I committed myself to giving a class. It was actually in GIE in the olden days.
Yep.
I committed myself to giving a class just about my experience of doing research. So I just told the story I think I told here. And it helped me so much. I cannot, just to have students like, to just be able to share honestly with them, like how complicated it was. And I got so much nice feedback from them and energy. And it really helped me to write, just to be able to talk with people.
Well,
Yeah.
it's been so helpful to talk to you, Scott, and I think we're going to really enjoy looking at the PDF of your dissertation. And
Okay.
someone's going to take over our rooms right now, so I think we have to say goodbye and thank you. And some students might take your class and hear more about what you just talked about.
Oh, yeah,
We
you
really
should. You
appreciate
should
it.
definitely take my classes. I didn't get to tell you about the kind of publications I'm interested in now, but
Oh
we'll
no,
save
that'll
that
be
for
next. Well, we're
another
getting kicked
time.
out, so next time. Thanks,
Another
Scott.
time.